The real history of the Valkyries, a horizon of iron-grey clouds, drifting low over the northern world. Wind moves like a living thing across the frozen earth, carrying the echo of shields striking shields, of warriors breathing their last in the bitter cold. In this space between the seen and the remembered, the Norse imagined a presence greater than any mortal army, the silent riders who chose which souls would rise, and which would fade into forgotten dust. These were the Valkyries. Forged not of flesh, but of stormlight and fate, they stood at the threshold where death becomes destiny. In the oldest poems of the poetic Edda, they descend through the sky like falling stars, their armor glinting with the cold fire of the heavens. Their horses leave burning trails across the clouds, and wherever they ride, the boundary between life and afterlife thins like frost beneath the morning sun. But beneath the myth lies something older, something shaped by real Viking beliefs about honor, courage, and the fragile line between chaos and order. To the Norse, death was not simply an ending. It was a choosing. A warrior's final breath needed a witness, a divine judge who could lift the worthy toward Valhalla or leave the unworthy to wander the shadowed fields of hell. Across burial mounds, carved stones, and runic fragments scattered through Scandinavia, we find traces of these mysterious maidens. Their names appear like sparks: Brynhilda, Sigrun, Gunna, Hilda, each one tied to battle, to destiny, to the unrelenting truth that every life bends toward its appointed end. And so the story of the Valkyries begins not with war, but with the quiet certainty that somewhere in the storm above, someone is watching, waiting to guide the fallen home. Chapter 1. Whispers from the Old North. Picture this: a cold dawn spreading across the ancient north, long before kingdoms carved borders into the land. Frost lies thick across the ground. The earth feels young, yet heavy with stories waiting to be born. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a raven lifts into the pale sky. Its wings cut through the morning silence like a reminder that this world, wild and wandering, is always listening. Before empires rose, before kingdoms hardened into stone, the Norse carved meaning out of the raw forces of nature. They lived in a land where winter ruled like an ancient king, where storms moved like spirits across the horizon, and where the line between the seen and unseen blurred with every shifting shadow. In this world, myth did not stand apart from daily life. Myth breathed beneath it, shaping every fear, every hope, every prayer whispered into the wind. It is here, in these early northern landscapes, that the first traces of the Valkyries begin to appear. Not in full stories, not in painted halls or carved statues, but in whispers, fragments of verses, shards of poems passed from fire to fire, memory to memory. Their earliest forms were faint, like silhouettes moving through mist. They were spirits of choice, of death, of destiny. They belonged to the battlefield, yet they were not warriors, not yet. Instead, they hovered like dreams at the edge of the human world, guiding souls toward realms unseen. In the shadow of the fjords, among tribes that left no written record, belief flowed like the rivers that carved through ice and stone. The Norse world of the first centuries was shaped not by one story, but by many. Oral tradition carried their truths. Skalds, the poets of the early North, held the past inside their voices, reciting epics as easily as others breathed. And in those pre-literate days, when memory was the only library, the Valkyries existed as quiet forces of fate. They were watchers of the fallen, guardians of the threshold between breath and silence. Sources from this era are scattered and fragile. Archaeology gives us broken hints: a carved figure in bronze, a scratched symbol on a piece of bone, burial goods arranged in patterns we can only guess at. These traces tell us more about belief than about form. To the Norse, death on the battlefield was a sacred crossing. It demanded presence. It demanded judgment. Warriors were not left alone as they fell. Something moved beside them, something greater than human. Picture a shield wall trembling beneath the charge of an enemy tribe. Spears rattle in the cold. The ground shakes with every step. And in that moment when the first warrior falls, the air shifts. To the early Norse imagination, this shift was not just the release of breath. It was the arrival of a chooser, a being capable of guiding the soul toward its rightful place. This early understanding of the Valkyries reflects a world still forming its spiritual landscape. before they became shining maidens in golden armor, before they rode horses streaking fire across the sky, they were figures carved from silence and destiny. They resembled spirits more than warriors, fate-bearers rather than fighters. Their power lay not in the sword, but in the quiet authority to decide who lived on through honor and who slipped into the cold shadows of hell. The earliest poems of the North describe a universe woven together by unseen hands. In these verses, the Valkyries glide across battlefields like wind shaping snow. They do not speak. They do not raise weapons. They simply move calm, unhurried, inevitable. To a culture surrounded by the constant threat of conflict, this idea offered both comfort and fear. Comfort, because no warrior died unseen. Fear, because no man could predict when his name would be called, or by whom. Across the regions of early Scandinavia, beliefs shifted with each passing generation. Yet the image of the gidding female spirit, the one who stands beside death, remained constant. In some areas, she resembled an ancestor spirit. In others, she looked more like a fierce nature being tied to storms and ravens. But in every version, her presence carried weight. It reminded men that destiny was not found on the battlefield alone. It descended from the heavens, from realms where gods and spirits shaped the fates of mortals like metal on an anvil. Historical evidence from this period is thin, but the fragments speak clearly. Runes found on old stones mention women linked to victory and battle luck. Burials reveal figurines of winged female forms placed beside warriors who died with honor. Even the structure of early Norse cosmology suggests that the idea of divine choosers, beings who bridge life and afterlife, grew naturally from their understanding of the world. Picture the longhouses where families gathered through winter storms, firelight presses against the darkness. A storyteller raises a hand, weaving the old tales into the glow of the embers. Children listen with wide eyes. Warriors sit quietly, sharpening their blades. And the Valkyries drift through these stories, shaping the silence between words. They are reminders that courage has a witness, and that fate is never blind. Emotion defined these beliefs as much as ritual. The Norse did not see the world as safe or predictable. Every storm could be a message. Every death could be a sign. To them, the Valkyries were not distant gods. They were close, close enough to feel, close enough to fear. They stood beside battlefields, yes, but also beside choices. They represented the moment when a life reaches its final measure, when the earth demands something in return for the breath it once gave. And as centuries passed, the concept deepened. The Valkyries became symbols not only of death, but of judgment, honor, and belonging. Over time, their roles expanded, evolving through poetry, saga, and ritual. But in these earliest traditions, before myth took its full shape, they remained soft outlines in the mist, powerful precisely because they were not yet defined. Mystery gave them strength. Silence made them holy. This chapter of their story reveals a truth about the ancient North. Every belief began as a whisper. These whispers grew into the mythology we know today, layered by generations of storytellers who shaped them into figures of beauty, terror, and destiny. Yet beneath all later embellishments, the original image remains, the quiet presence on the battlefield, the unseen hand guiding the fallen toward their fate. And when we look back across the centuries, through the frost and fire that shaped the early Norse world, that whisper still lingers. It reminds us that long before legends were written, they were felt. Felt in the wind that touched a warrior's face. Felt in the silence after a final breath. Felt in the belief that no life ends without meaning. For in the Old North, destiny did not rise from kings or empires. It drifted through the air like snow. It watched from the edges of battle. And sometimes, when the veil grew thin, it took the form of a maiden born from the breath of war, a Valkyrie, whispering a name into the endless winter sky. Chapter 2: Daughters of Fate and Stormlight. A cold northern sky hangs over the early Viking world, its clouds layered like ancient pages filled with secrets not yet spoken. Beneath this shifting veil, a belief begins to take shape, a belief that fate is not an empty idea, but a living force, moving through the world like wind across open water. The Norse did not imagine destiny as distant or abstract. They felt it around them, close enough to touch, close enough to fear. In the shadow of sacred groves, and beside the quiet waters of deep fjords, They told of beings who shaped the paths of all lives. These were the Norns, the weavers of destiny, who tended the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree that held all realms in balance. They carved the stories of mortals and gods into the great flow of time, marking each birth and each ending with silent precision. Their presence stretched beyond myth and into the fabric of belief itself. To live in the Norse world was to live beneath the eyes of these unseen keepers. As Norse cosmology matured, a new connection began to form. The earliest mystic spirits of the battlefield, the Valkyries, were drawn into the orbit of the Norns. Slowly, mythmakers of the Old North began to imagine them not merely as watchers of death, but as extensions of cosmic order. They were bound to the same forces that shaped the universe from fire and ice. They were daughters of fate, born from the stormlight that divided the worlds of the living and the dead. The poems that survive from this period hint at a quiet evolution. Early lines describe the Norns carving runes of destiny into wood and stone, while later verses show the Valkyries acting out those same destinies across the fields of war. The Norns wrote. The Valkyries carried out what was written. Together, they formed a bridge between the cosmic and the mortal, between eternity and a single heartbeat. In the deep tones of the poetic Edda, the Valkyries move with new weight. No longer drifting shapes of the afterlife, they step forward as beings with purpose and judgment. Their armor gleams with the cold light of the northern sky. Their presence is not merely a sign of death, but of decision. They ride at the edge of thunder, guided by Odin, the god who seeks wisdom in every hidden place. Through him, they become not only choosers of the slain, but instruments of a plan larger than any warrior could imagine. In this era, Odin's influence shapes nearly every story of the Valkyries. As a god obsessed with knowledge and the gathering of the worthy, he becomes the axis around which they turn. His desire to fill Valhalla with strong, fearless warriors creates a purpose that the Valkyries must fulfill. When they descend to the battlefield, they do so with eyes sharpened by fate. They do not choose at random. They select those whose courage will serve Odin in the struggles to come, the final battle of Ragnarök, when the world will be tested by fire and darkness. This connection to Odin alters them. In earlier centuries, they were soft outlines in the mist. Now they are figures charged with divine authority. Their movements carry the weight of fate itself. When they lift a fallen warrior from the earth, it is not an act of mercy, but of alignment with the story written by the Norns. Every chosen soul is a thread pulled into the larger tapestry of the cosmos. Across Scandinavia, archaeological finds reflect this transformation. Bronze pendants shaped like female riders, stones etched with scenes of women carrying spears and banners, grave goods that hint at beliefs merging myth with ritual. These figures are no longer vague spirits. They stand as recognizable beings, guardians of death, heralds of honor, messengers of divine will. This shift reveals something important about the emotional world of the Vikings. In an age defined by struggle, their beliefs needed structure. Chaos surrounded them, storms, long winters, endless conflict. To face these forces, they forged myths that provided meaning. By tying the Valkyries to the Norns, they imagined a universe where nothing was accidental. Every life had a shape. Every end had a purpose. Even the most violent death became part of a story shaped before birth. In the sagas, the Valkyries begin to take on individual identities. Names rise from the poems like sparks. Skuld, often linked to one of the Norns herself, tied to the future yet to unfold. Gunnar, connected to the fierce cry of battle. Rota, known for storm-like fury. These names show their expanding roles. They are no longer passive carriers of souls. They guide, they judge, they intervene. Some bring victory, others bring destruction. Through them, fate becomes visible. Warriors understood this intimately. When they entered battle, they believed they fought under the gaze of these daughters of Stormlight. A sudden gust of wind, a shift in the sky, a moment of instinct, all could be signs that a Valkyrie was near. This belief shaped courage. It shaped fear. It shaped the way Vikings met death, not as an end, but as a calling delivered by divine hands. As the mythology matured, stories began to merge the Valkyries, celestial power with human emotion. They were depicted not only as agents of fate, but as beings capable of loyalty, betrayal, compassion, and sorrow. Some sagas describe Valkyries who favor certain warriors, gifting them with subtle protection. Others tell of Valkyries punished for choosing differently than Odin commanded. These tales reveal the tension between free will and fate, a question that echoes through every myth of the North. At the heart of this chapter lies a profound transformation. The Valkyries shift from shapeless spirits to purposeful beings shaped by the deepest currents of Norse belief. They become the visible hands of destiny, descending from the sky not just to collect the fallen, but to shape the stories of gods and men. Through this evolution, the Norse world grows richer, more structured, more connected to the cosmic forces that defined its understanding of life and death. And in the quiet space between myth and memory, a revelation begins to form. Fate in the Old North was never distant. It was near, carried by the wings of riders born from Stormlight. Each choice they made echoed the runes carved by the Norns beneath the World Tree. Each life they touched became part of a story older than any empire, older than any written word. Through them, the Norse found meaning in the chaos of the world. Through them, they believed that even the final breath was guided, measured, and held by something greater than fear. And as the centuries shift like snow across ancient fields, the image of the Valkyries continues to evolve, no longer mere spirits, but daughters of fate itself, carrying the storm in their hands and the weight of destiny in their silent, unbroken gaze. Chapter 3: Odin's Chosen Messengers of War. A northern dusk settles over worlds shaped by the weight of gods and memory. The wind moves across the mountains like an old hymn, carrying with it the stories that lived long before they were ever written. In this fading light, the figure of a wanderer emerges, a god cloaked in shadow, a single eye burning like an ember against the cold. Odin, seeker of wisdom, breaker of boundaries, the one who traded comfort for knowledge and peace for power. It is within his long search for understanding that the Valkyries find their sharpest purpose. They become more than spirits of fate. They become his companions, his messengers, and the living links between the world of men and the distant halls of the gods. As Norse myth enters the age of sagas, the Valkyries rise into fuller form. No longer drifting shapes at the edge of battle, they appear as radiant riders descending through smoke and storm. Their armor shines with the pale glow of the northern sky. Their horses charge through clouds thick with ash. And wherever they ride, the air shifts, not with fear, but with the certainty that destiny has arrived. In this era, Odin's command reshapes everything they touch. His desire to gather the strongest warriors in existence gives the Valkyries a new mission. They travel across Midgard, watching the rise and fall of armies, measuring the worth of each fighter who stands on the field. Courage becomes their compass. Honor becomes their mark. Through their choices, entire tribes rise to legend or disappear into silence. In saga after saga, the connection between Odin and the Valkyries deepens. He relies on them not only as choosers of the slain, but as strategists in the great unfolding of fate. Their presence is woven into his grand design, a plan that looks beyond the present age toward a distant battle that would shake the roots of creation. Ragnarök. Every warrior sent to Valhalla strengthens the host he will one day lead. Every soul selected becomes a thread in the fabric of a prophecy that cannot be stopped, only prepared for. This divine purpose shapes the way storytellers describe them. They are fierce, but not chaotic, beautiful, but never fragile. They ride with a stillness that cuts through the roar of war. Their hands do not tremble when they lift a fallen hero from the earth. Their eyes reflect both the tragedy and the triumph of battle, as though they carry within them the memory of every life they have ever taken into the next world. In the poetic Edda, they appear beside Odin not as servants, but as trusted allies. Some bring warnings of battles yet to come. Others prepare feasts for the chosen in Valhalla, ensuring that the honored dead remain strong and ready. There, inside the great hall with its golden roof and spears for rafters, they serve mead to the Einherjar, the warriors who will fight beside the gods at the end of days. This role is not one of servitude, it is one of significance. They nourish the future defenders of the cosmos. Archaeological evidence from this period echoes the changing myth. pendants shaped like armed maidens, stones carved with riders holding spears angled toward the earth, warriors buried with symbols of female guardians watching over them. These images do not depict shadowy spirits. They show fierce women who stand at Odin's side, guiding the souls he desires most. The sagas add further depth, describing Valkyries who walk among mortals, influencing battles, inspiring warriors, and protecting those favored by Odin. Some stories tell of Valkyries who fall in love with human heroes, drawn by their courage and devotion. Others speak of Valkyries punished for choosing differently than Odin commanded, revealing the tension between their judgment and his will. Through these tales, they become more than mythic figures. They become characters with agency, emotion, and the power to shape the fate of nations. The battlefield becomes their stage. When warriors speak of victory, they often point to the presence of a Valkyrie as the cause. When defeat falls like a shadow, they blame her as well, believing that she turned her gaze elsewhere. This belief transforms every battle into something sacred. A warrior's courage is not simply measured by his actions, but by whether a Valkyrie judges him worthy of joining Odin's eternal host. In this understanding, death becomes a form of ascension. To fall in battle is not to lose, but to be chosen. This shift in meaning shapes Viking culture at its core. The fear of death softens under the weight of divine purpose. Honor becomes more valuable than survival. A warrior enters the field not only to protect land or family, but to prove himself before eyes that do not belong to this world. Under Odin's guidance, the Valkyries become arbiters of this sacred exchange. They turn the chaos of war into a pathway toward eternal glory. Their choices echo far beyond the battlefield. Each warrior sent to Valhalla becomes part of Odin's growing strength. Each soul gathered is a step toward the final conflict foretold in ancient prophecy. Yet this divine bond also raises a quiet question, one the sagas whisper between lines. Do the Valkyries choose by Odin's will alone, or do they carry their own sense of justice? The myths offer glimpses of both. Some Valkyries act with unwavering obedience. Others defy him, moved by compassion or loyalty to a mortal hero. These moments reveal their complexity, not as mere extensions of a god, but as beings shaped by emotion as much as duty. In the Volsunga saga, for instance, a Valkyrie's choice alters the course of entire dynasties. In Helgakvitha Hundingsbana, a Valkyrie becomes both guardian and beloved, guiding a hero through victory and death. These stories reflect a belief that even divine messengers can feel the weight of their decisions. They judge not only with power, but with heart. Through Odin's command, the Valkyries become central to the spiritual world of the Vikings. They embody the tension between life and death, fate and freedom, war and transcendence. Their presence confirms that the battlefield is never empty. Something greater watches every moment. And as the sagas pass into history, a quiet truth emerges. Odin seeks warriors, but the Valkyries decide which warriors reach him. Their choices shape his army, his legends, and the future of the cosmos. They stand beside the one-eyed wanderer not as shadows, but as the luminous force that turns war into destiny. Thus, in the age when saga meets story, the Valkyries become the living fire of Odin's will, fierce riders who descend through smoke and spearfall to lift the worthy from the ruin of battle. Through them, death becomes a passage, glory becomes a calling, and war, in all its fear and fury, becomes a stage for divine purpose. In the silence that follows every battle, their presence lingers, not as echoes of violence, but as reminders that even in the darkest hour, destiny rides on wings of storm and starlight, guided by the messengers of a god who seeks wisdom in every fallen soul. Chapter 4: The Birth of the Shield-Maidens. A northern morning breaks across a landscape carved by iron and frost. The light spreads slowly, as though reluctant to disturb the silence of the earth. In this quiet, the old stories begin to transform. The Valkyries, once spirits of fate, once companions of Odin, begin to change again. Their shapes sharpen. Their steps grow heavier. The air around them takes on the weight of steel and the breath of battle. This is the moment when myth begins to echo something real. As Norse poetry entered a new age, poets no longer saw the Valkyries only as celestial choosers or distant messengers. They imagined them stepping into the heart of war, bearing shields that glimmered like winter sun on ice. Spears rested in their hands as naturally as wind rests on the sea. Their armor rang with the clarity of purpose. Stories began to describe them not just as guides of the dead, but as warriors in their own right, fierce, resolute, and unbound. The line between myth and mortal life blurred. In the sagas, shield-maidens appeared beside the Valkyries as reflections of one another. Some were human, some divine, some drifting somewhere between the two. The Norse imagination embraced the idea that a woman could stand on the battlefield with the same force as any king. She could fight. She could command. She could fall with honor. This vision grew not only from fantasy, but from the complexities of Viking society. Though the historical record is fragmentary, evidence suggests that women did, on rare occasions, take up arms. Burials discovered in recent decades show female bodies laid to rest with weapons and symbols of military rank. Whether these women fought in life or held ceremonial roles remains debated, yet their presence in the archaeological record inspired questions that stirred the old beliefs. The sagas amplified these questions into legend. In Hervarar saga, a woman named Herva dresses as a warrior, wielding her father's enchanted sword. In Eyjolf's saga Kraka, shield maidens stand among kings and heroes. These stories do not treat women warriors as impossible fantasies. They treat them as exceptional, yet believable figures born from courage and necessity. Into this cultural landscape stepped the evolving image of the Valkyrie. Once ethereal, she now felt close enough to touch. She rode into war alongside mortal armies, helmed and armored like any warrior. Her spear became a symbol not only of death's approach, but of a woman's unwavering strength. Her presence reinforced the idea that bravery had no fixed shape. The battlefield could belong to anyone whose spirit met it without fear. This transformation also reshaped the emotional identity of the Valkyries. Their strength no longer came only from divine authority. It came from autonomy. They chose when to intervene. They chose whom to protect. They chose what path they walked between the worlds of gods and men. The poets described them as radiant, fierce, and self-driven, women whose power came from purpose, not permission. In this era, their stories reached a new kind of intensity. Descriptions of their armor shimmer with poetic detail. Their movements carry a gravity that feels both mortal and otherworldly. They take on roles not solely defined by Odin's command, but by their own desires and loyalties. Some shield maidens in the sagas lead armies. Some avenge their kin. Others seek adventure across seas and kingdoms. Through them, the Valkyrie myth expands beyond fate and into agency. The connection between myth and real life is subtle but important. Viking society valued strength, honor, and capability. While warfare was overwhelmingly the realm of men, the culture did not completely restrict the roles women might assume. They managed households, estates, trade, and diplomacy. They commanded respect. In times of crisis, some may have taken up arms. Their presence in stories reflects this cultural flexibility, a curiosity, a possibility, a boundary that could be crossed under the right conditions. The poets embraced that possibility and allowed it to grow until it shaped the legend itself. The Valkyries, now imagined as divine shield maidens, became icons of independence. Their stories revealed a world in which women could carry both destiny and steel, both prophecy and power. This evolution enriched Norse myth, giving it a balance between the cosmic and the human, the divine and the earthly. Their image became one of fire cutting through darkness, a rider cresting a hill with her spear raised high, a warrior queen whose armor gleamed like silver struck by lightning, a protector who chose her battles with clarity and conviction. In every depiction, the shield maiden form of the Valkyrie carried a spark that resonated across centuries, the spark of resistance, courage, and the refusal to bow before fate without a fight. As their identity evolved, so too did their emotional resonance. These Valkyries were no longer distant observers of death. They became symbols of strength in life. They represented not only the end of battle, but the act of standing firm within it. They showed that honor could be claimed by anyone brave enough to reach for it, regardless of birth or destiny. Archaeological finds, add further layers to this understanding. Weapons placed beside women in burial mounds, brooches shaped like armed maidens, artworks depicting female figures holding shields and spears. These artifacts do not confirm every legend, but they anchor the myth within the lived world of the Norse. They suggest that the idea of a woman warrior existed long before the sagas gave it divine shape. The Shield Maiden became a bridge, connecting the everyday strength of Norse women with the mythic power of the Valkyries. Through this bridge, the stories gained new energy. They spoke not only to the fear of death, but to the desire for agency. They offered a vision of women who shaped their own destinies, who fought for honor, who chose paths carved by their own hands. This transformation left a lasting imprint on the Norse imagination. The warrior woman became one of its most enduring symbols, fierce, unbreakable, etched into the memory of a culture defined by resilience. And though the historical truth remains uncertain, the emotional truth is unmistakable. The stories reveal what the people admired, what they dreamed, and what they believed might be possible when courage stood above all else. By the time the sagas reached their full form, the Valkyries had become icons of the Shield Maiden ideal. They bridged heaven and earth, mortality and divinity. They carried the strength of warriors and the wisdom of fate. Whether descending from the sky or riding at the head of an earthly army, they embodied a power that felt both ancient and eternal. Through poetry, belief, and imagination, the Shield Maiden form of the Valkyrie became a testament to the Norse world's understanding of strength, not just the strength to fight, but the strength to choose one's own path. And in the quiet echoes of those old stories, their presence lingers still, radiant riders born from myth and memory, carrying shields that shine through time, reminding us that courage is not bound by form, but by the fire within the one who carries it. Chapter 5. Runes, Rituals, and Sacred Offerings. A cold wind moves across the burial mounds of the north, stirring the grass that has grown thick over centuries of silence. Beneath these gentle rises of earth lie stories not written on parchment, but carved into the bones, iron, and ash of the ancient world. Here, where the past rests in fragments, archaeology begins to whisper in a voice older than any saga. It tells of rituals, runes, and sacred offerings that shaped the earliest understanding of the Valkyries, not through poetry alone, but through the customs of a people who carried their beliefs into every corner of life and death. Long before the Valkyries appeared as radiant riders in myth, the Norse already honored forces connected to battle and destiny. They believed the world was full of spirits who watched from beyond the edges of sight. When warriors entered combat, they were never alone. Something unseen moved with them, guiding or guarding, choosing or abandoning. And when they fell, the living turned to ritual to make sense of their loss. Archaeology gives us glimpses into these moments. In burial mounds across Scandinavia, researchers have uncovered grave where weapons were placed beside female remains, swords, spears, shields, arrowheads. These objects suggest that the line between spiritual guardians and mortal women was not drawn as sharply as later stories might imply. Some of these women may have been leaders, warriors, or protectors. Others may have held ceremonial roles, acting as intermediaries between the living and the unseen. Such discoveries challenge simple interpretations. They invite us to look deeper into a culture where myth and daily life were woven together like the threads of a single tapestry. The presence of weapons in female grave does not prove the existence of shield maidens in every case, but it reveals a respect for the idea of female power, a space within Norse society where women could occupy roles that blended strength, ritual, and spiritual authority. Runestones add another layer to this understanding. Some bear inscriptions that honor women with titles associated with battle or leadership. These stones, standing tall against centuries of weather, hint at lives lived with courage and recognition. They remind us that the Norse world was not rigid, but fluid, shaped by circumstances, shaped by belief, shaped by the memory of those who stood out in their time. These materials form a bridge between myth and reality. They help explain how the idea of the Valkyries could grow from the soil of lived experience. The stories did not emerge from a vacuum. They grew from customs, from symbols, from rituals that gave structure to grief and meaning to bravery. In the shadow of these burial fields, traces of sacred offerings deepen the picture. Excavations reveal horses buried alongside warriors, their bodies arranged with care and intention. Horses were more than mere animals to the Norse. They were symbols of transition, spirit, and travel between realms. Their inclusion suggests a belief that the dead required guidance, a companion for the journey into the unknown, perhaps reflecting the early concept of divine escorts like the Valkyries. Fragments of silver appear in some grave, placed near the hands or mouths of the deceased. Elsewhere, archaeologists uncover sharpened steel laid purposefully across the chest or feet. These objects were not random. They were offerings, gestures meant to honor the fallen and invite protection from unseen forces. Whether the rituals invoked spirits of fate, ancestors, or early forms of the Valkyries remains beyond certainty, yet the symbolism speaks clearly. The Norse believed that death opened a door, and that the passage through it required both courage and guidance. As these discoveries come together, a larger picture forms. The people of the North did not worship battle for its own sake. They respected the weight of it, the fear, the loss, the hope that courage might outlive the body. Rituals became a way to confront this truth. Offerings gave shape to the emotions that words could not hold, and through them, the idea of spiritual guardians gained substance. In this world, the Valkyries emerge not only from poetry, but from practice. They become the embodiment of rituals designed to ease the transition from life to death. Their roots stretch into the very heart of Norse funerary traditions, into the moments when loved ones stood beside open grave, wondering where the spirit had gone, wondering who might receive it on the other side. Some grave contained staffs carried by women, believed to be Verla, seeresses who spoke for the gods and guided communities through prophecy and ceremony. These women, wrapped in furs and adorned with bronze, may have been living echoes of what the Valkyries would later represent. Their presence reveals a spiritual landscape where the boundary between human and divine was porous, shaped by belief and necessity. The connection deepens when we look at ritual sites far from the burial grounds. In lakes and bogs, offerings of weapons have been discovered, spears bent out of shape, swords broken, shields abandoned to the dark waters. These were sacrifices to forces unseen, placed deliberately in environments believed to touch the otherworld. The Norse trusted that their offerings would be received by beings who moved between realms, beings who carried influence over life, death, and destiny. Whether these beings were thought of as early Valkyries remains uncertain, yet the parallels are striking. Both rituals and myths describe forces that judge the worthy. Both hint at powers who watch over battles, who shape outcomes, who guide the fallen. Archaeology does not give us stories, but it gives us context, the material world from which those stories grew. Through these discoveries, we see a culture that lived in close conversation with the supernatural. The living sought guidance from forces tied to fate. The dead were honored with offerings meant to ease their passage. And across this landscape emerged the belief in watchers, spirits who walked the line between earth and the unseen, carrying choices that shaped the destiny of warriors. The emotional need behind these rituals is clear. War brought grief. It brought fear. It brought questions that no human answer could satisfy. By imagining guardians who oversaw the battlefield, the Norse found a way to understand loss. They found comfort in the thought that no warrior fell alone. They believed that strength was recognized, that courage mattered, that the final breath was not the end, but the beginning of a journey. In this way, the Valkyries entered the world not only through myth, but through meaning. They became symbols of guidance, of honor, of the unseen hands that carry life into eternity. The offerings left at grave, the runes etched into stone, the rituals performed under the open sky, all point to a society seeking connection with forces that shaped existence. And as the centuries passed, these practices left their imprint on the mythology. The Valkyrie grew into a figure who blended spirituality with war, ritual with battle, the sacred with the human. Her story became the reflection of a people who looked to the sky not for victory alone, but for comfort, for justice, and for the assurance that destiny did not abandon its own. Through runes, rituals, and sacred offerings, The Norse carved meaning into the fragile spaces between life and death. And in those spaces, the Valkyries took shape, guardians born from the deepest echoes of human hope, carrying the fallen into the quiet beyond the storm. Chapter 6. Riders Across the Battlefield Mist. A dense mist settles across the early Viking battlefield, clinging to the earth like a veil drawn between worlds. The sound of approaching conflict trembles in the air, the low rumble of shields, the distant ring of iron, the broken prayers of warriors preparing to meet their fate. In this suspended moment, the sagas say the sky begins to stir. The mist coils upward, the wind hardens, and through the shifting white curtain, shapes take form. This is the age in which the Valkyries become truly visible. Earlier centuries imagined them as quiet spirits, unseen hands guiding the fallen. But by the height of the Viking Age, storytellers begin to give them form, not only presence, but radiance. They descend through storm clouds like streaks of pale fire. Their armor reflects the cold northern light. Their hair flows like banners of gold or shadow. And their eyes, poets say, hold the knowledge of every destiny ever written. They ride across the mist not as distant symbols, but as beings who belong entirely to the battlefield. Their arrival marks a turning of the tide, a moment when life narrows into a single breath. To the warriors who fought beneath them, they were omens, terrifying in their beauty, absolute in their judgment. Their very presence meant that death had arrived with purpose. The sagas describe scenes filled with motion and stillness blended together. One moment, chaos erupts, shields splinter, arrows cut through air, blood strikes the frozen ground. The next, a rider appears above the clash, moving with a calm that does not belong to this world. She does not shout commands or strike blows. Instead, she chooses. A gesture, a glance, a subtle shift in her spear, these acts determine who will stand and who will fall. This was the cinematic power of the Valkyries. They were not fighters in the human sense. Their strength lay in the authority of fate. They hovered at the border between life and death, carrying within them the weight of 1,000 endings. The sagas portray them as beings who understand the shape of battle long before the first sword is drawn. Their foresight bends the course of war, shaping legends long before they are told. Their arrival on the battlefield often comes with atmospheric force. The sky darkens, mist thickens, wind spins low across the ground. These natural elements became inseparable from their mythic presence. The Norse did not imagine them as silent watchers. They imagined them as storm-born figures whose descent marked a breach between worlds. In their wake, the world seemed thinner, sharpened, ready to reveal whatever truth lies beyond the final heartbeat. To the warriors below, they offered both dread and reassurance. For those seeking honor, their presence was a blessing, a sign that the gods were watching, that courage would not disappear into the void. For those uncertain of their worth, their appearance chilled the blood. A Valkyrie's gaze could lift a soul into Odin's hall or let it slip into shadow. And because their judgment was absolute, no warrior could predict his fate with certainty until the very moment the choice was made. The sagas offer many visions of this moment. In Engjall's saga, a group of women is seen beside a loom, weaving the fates of warriors with threads soaked in blood, a symbolic reflection of Valkyries shaping war itself. In Helgakvitha Hundingsbana, riders descend in shimmering ranks, their armor bright against the dim horizon. These scenes do not merely embellish the story, they capture the emotional truth of the Viking worldview. The battlefield was not a place of random violence. It was a sacred arena where life met its appointed end. From the perspective of the Norse, the mist itself became a metaphor for uncertainty and choice. Before every warrior lay a future obscured by fog, unknown, shifting, full of possibility. The Valkyries moved through this mist with clarity, seeing paths invisible to mortal eyes. Their presence promised that no death was meaningless. Each fall marked the turning of fate's wheel, a movement within the cosmic design traced by gods and spirits long before men took up arms. Archaeology complements these stories with iconic imagery. Brooches depict armored women riding horses that seem to leap from one world to another. Stones carry carved figures holding spears angled toward the earth. These objects reflect not only belief, but emotion, the awe that filled the hearts of warriors who felt watched by forces far greater than themselves. Yet for all their radiance and terror, the Valkyries do not come to the battlefield for cruelty. Their purpose is neither to revel in bloodshed nor to punish the fallen. They come to carry out a sacred duty, one rooted deeply in the cosmology of the North. The clash of armies is merely the surface of something larger. Beneath the noise lies fate, a slow, steady current that the Valkyries guide with grave precision. Their presence also reflects the emotional needs of the Viking Age. In a world shaped by hardship, loss, and constant conflict, the idea of divine witnesses brought comfort. Warriors faced the possibility of death every season. The belief that their last moment would be observed, that their final effort might earn a place in Valhalla offered meaning where otherwise there would be fear. This belief transformed battle into a ritual of bravery. Every step taken across the field became a test of character. Every lifted shield, every final stand, became a message to the unseen riders above. See me, judge me, remember me. In this way, the Valkyries served not only the gods, but the living. They turned the chaos of war into a narrative of purpose. They gave form to the idea that even in death, one might rise. The battlefield, under their watch, became a threshold, a doorway between the mortal world and the halls of eternity. The mist that rolled across the ground was not simply weather. It was the veil of the unseen, the border that the Valkyries alone could cross. Their horses seemed to glide above the earth. Their spears glimmered as though lit by an inner flame, and their choices echoed louder than any clash of iron. Through them, the Viking imagination created a space where fear and hope lived side by side. The Valkyries embodied the truth that destiny is not gentle, but it is just. They held the quiet knowledge that every life, no matter how fierce or fragile, must one day meet its end. And when that moment came, they were there, steady, radiant, bearing the weight of both worlds. As the sagas continued to grow, this image solidified. The Valkyries were no longer distant figures defined by fate alone. They became symbols of transition, power, and the solemn beauty of a life meeting its purpose. Their wings of mist and light stretched across generations, shaping the stories told around hearth fires and in the long echo of oral tradition. In this chapter of their evolution, the Valkyries stand at their most striking, riders descending through the swirling fog, choosing with gestures, soft as breath or fierce as the fall of a blade. Their presence turns the battlefield into a place where mortality touches the realm of the gods, and where every departing soul becomes part of a story far older than war itself. Through them, death becomes a passage, battle becomes a threshold, and the mist that rises from the earth becomes the stage for one of the most enduring visions of the Norse imagination. The shining riders who move between worlds, carrying destiny in their silent, unyielding gaze. Chapter 7. The Binding of Mortal Hearts. A quiet dusk falls over the northern world, softening the edges of the land, as though preparing it for a story that does not belong entirely to gods or mortals. In this dim light, the boundary between realms grows thin. The sagas tell us that in such moments, the Valkyries sometimes crossed into the lives of men, not as distant riders streaking through battle, but as women of extraordinary presence, shaped by fate, yet carrying an ache that even divine beings could not escape. Here, the mythology takes on a human pulse. Though crafted from stormlight and destiny, the Valkyries were often drawn toward mortal hearts. Their stories reveal a longing that stretches beyond the battlefield, beyond the strict duties of Odin's will. They appear in sagas as wanderers, companions, lovers, and guides, walking a fragile line between two worlds that could never fully meet. In Helgakvitha Hundingsbana, a Valkyrie called Sigrun enters the life of a mortal hero. She does not appear with thunder or command. Instead, she becomes a presence that shapes his path. Their connection grows through shared purpose, yet it carries the shadow of a truth neither can escape. Her destiny is rooted in divine duty, his in the mortal world. Their love brings victory, but it also plants the seeds of tragedy. The saga holds both emotions with quiet honesty, triumph and sorrow, woven together like strands of fate. This tension lies at the heart of Valkyrie mythology. They are beings of judgment, tasked with choosing who will die and who will rise to honor. Yet when they step into mortal lives, they reveal another side, one that feels, hopes, and grieves. Their myth shows that even divine forces struggle against the currents of destiny. Across the sagas, these encounters take many forms. Some Valkyries appear as protectors, guiding mortal heroes away from disaster. Others arrive with warnings, offering glimpses of futures carved by the Norns. These moments reflect the deep cultural belief that fate was not simply a force imposed on life, but a dialogue, a weaving between divine intention and human choice. There are also stories of Valkyries who become catalysts for transformation. In Volsunga saga, Brynhild is introduced as a shield maiden of breathtaking strength, punished for choosing a king against Odin's command. Cast into the mortal world, she becomes both heroine and tragic figure, her love for Sigurd binding their destinies together in a cycle of passion and betrayal. Though often remembered for heartbreak, her story reveals the emotional depth that the Norse imagined within the divine. She is powerful, flawed, and bound by forces larger than herself, a reflection of the human struggle framed within mythic scale. These tales are not merely romantic, they carry a deeper resonance about the nature of mortality. When the divine touches the human, the outcome is rarely gentle. Love collapses under the weight of prophecy. Friendship dissolves into duty. Warnings go unheeded. The sagas use Valkyrie encounters to explore a truth the Norse understood well. Every bond carries risk, and every choice echoes through the fabric of fate. The yearning that surrounds these encounters speaks to the emotional landscape of the Viking Age. People lived close to loss. They watched lives change in an instant, through war, illness, storms, or chance. A divine presence stepping into this fragile world offered meaning, however fleeting. The Valkyrie became a symbol of something unreachable, the idea that one could be chosen, noticed, or guided by a being who stood beyond the limits of mortality. Their relationships with mortals often carried themes of teaching or awakening. Some Valkyries impart wisdom, urging heroes to act with honor or caution. Others challenge them to rise above fear. In this way, the Valkyrie becomes a mirror, revealing both the strength and the fragility within human hearts. Through her, the hero confronts not only destiny but himself. But these connections always carry a cost. Divine beings are bound to cosmic rhythms. Their paths are etched by forces older than mountains. Mortals, by contrast, are shaped by seasons and sorrow. When a Valkyrie lingers too long in the human world, the tension becomes unavoidable. Some are summoned back by Odin. Others are undone by the prophecy they attempted to escape. In many stories, love becomes the very force that fractures the connection. The sagas present this tragedy with solemn clarity, suggesting that longing between realms is both beautiful and doomed. Yet the emotional power of these tales endures because they offer more than despair. They reveal the Norse belief in the transformative nature of encounter. A Valkyrie who steps into a mortal life changes it forever. Even if the union cannot last, its influence leaves a mark on kings who rule with new resolve, on warriors who accept their fate with courage, on poets who shape the memory of such meetings into timeless verse. In these narratives, the battlefield becomes only one arena where Valkyries exercise their influence. The human heart becomes another. They choose not only the slain, but the souls who will carry the weight of their touch. Their presence in the sagas amplifies human emotion, lifting it into the realm of the mythic. Archaeology hints at this emotional depth as well. Amulets depicting Valkyries, often held close to the chest, suggest that people sought their protection or favor in daily life. These tokens are small, carved with care, showing women offering cups, leading horses, or standing with spears. They represent the idea that the divine could move quietly beside the mortal world, unseen yet deeply felt. In this way, the Valkyries became woven into personal belief as much as cosmic order. People expected them not only on battlefields, but in moments of choice, danger, or longing. The sagas reflect this closeness through stories that blend the ordinary with the extraordinary. A traveler meets a woman on the road and senses fate in her gaze. A king dreams of a shining figure who warns him of betrayal. A poet describes a maiden whose beauty carries the chill of prophecy. Through these stories, the Norse imagination gives the Valkyries emotional dimension. They are not distant forces. They feel the pull of human lives, the warmth of affection, the pain of separation, the burden of choices they cannot change. Their divinity does not shield them from longing. If anything, it intensifies it. They stand between worlds, belonging fully to neither. This is the quiet truth at the heart of their mythology. The divine, too, knows sorrow. The sagas use the Valkyries to explore the cost of fate, not only for mortals, but for those who uphold it. Their relationships with humans reflect the tension between freedom and duty, desire and destiny. Through these connections, the stories reveal a universe in which emotional depth is not limited to human experience. Even beings shaped by cosmic law can ache for something beyond their reach. And so the Valkyries remain unforgettable, not only for their radiance in battle, but for their presence in the fragile spaces of human life. They walk beside kings and wanderers, shaping choices and altering paths. They bring warnings, comfort, and sometimes love. Their touch is both blessing and burden. In the end, their mythology tells us that every heart, mortal or divine, carries a longing to be seen, to be understood, to be remembered. Even the choosers of the slain were not immune to the pull of human stories. And in their rare steps across the boundary between worlds, they revealed a truth that still echoes. Destiny is not only written in battle, but in the quiet, unguarded moments where lives intersect and change forever. Chapter 8, Brynhild, Firebound and Forgotten. A quiet hush settles over the mythic landscape where gods once walked beside mortals. The air is still, as if holding its breath for the story of a Valkyrie whose glory, grief, and downfall shaped the heart of Norse legend. Among all the riders born of fate and storm, one name rises above the rest: Brynhild, warrior-maiden, oath-breaker, flame-bound exile. Her saga carries a weight that drifts through centuries, revealing how myth becomes human and how a divine spirit can break beneath the strain of destiny. Brynhild's story begins not with love, but with defiance. In the old telling, she stands as one of Odin's chosen, a Valkyrie whose duty is clear, whose judgment shapes victory and defeat. Yet in a moment of compassion or conviction, she chooses differently than the All-Father commands. The life she spares belongs to a king meant to fall. Her choice fractures the order of fate. The punishment is swift. Odin strips her of immortality and casts her into a sleep deeper than dreams. Around her he summons a ring of cursed fire, a circle of blazing punishment meant to ensure that only the bravest mortal could claim her. What begins as divine wrath becomes a story of waiting, a warrior trapped between what she was and what she must now become, suspended in a prison of burning light. The sagas describe this scene with solemn beauty. Brynhild lies in armor that gleams like pale gold, still a Valkyrie in form though no longer divine in freedom. The flames rise around her in a perfect circle. They roar the boundary between exile and awakening. Time passes without measure. Seasons turn beyond the fire, yet she remains untouched by them. Her fate waits for the sound of approaching footsteps. When Sigurd, the mortal hero, rides toward the fire, the saga shifts. He is young, fierce, and unaware of the story about to entwine his name with hers. His horse recoils from the blaze, but Sigurd urges him forward, driven by destiny he cannot yet comprehend. As he crosses the flames, the boundary between the mortal world and mythic ruin breaks open. What follows is one of the most striking transformations in Norse storytelling. Brynhild awakens not as a Valkyrie restored, but as a woman gifted with divine memory and bound by mortal limitation. Her wisdom, earned across ages of guiding the slain, becomes a burden. She sees futures that cannot be changed, betrayals not yet born, the fragile threads of a world that no mortal hand can steady. Her knowledge isolates her. Her strength draws admiration, but also fear. The flame that once encircled her becomes a symbol of what she cannot escape, the edge between duty and desire. In the early moments of their meeting, the connection between Brynhild and Sigurd shines with clarity. He seeks guidance. She offers truths shaped from her years among the gods. Their bond grows from admiration, forged in mutual respect. Yet even this companionship carries the shadow of what fate has already woven. The tragedy deepens when mortal politics and manipulation enter the tale. Through deception and sorcery, Sigurd is separated from Brynhild and bound to another. She, in turn, is given to a king she does not choose. Their paths twist into a maze of oaths, broken promises, and the slow unraveling of trust. What began with fire-born wonder now drifts towards sorrow, shaped by forces beyond their control. The sagas do not shield us from Brynhild's anguish. Once a chooser of the slain, she now becomes the one chosen by destiny's cruelty. Her pride, forged from centuries of battle and divine purpose, becomes the source of her downfall. Her heart, once steady as the spear she carried, cracks beneath betrayal. The transformation is profound. A being once sculpted from cosmic will now suffers as any mortal would, gripped by a love that brings ruin rather than salvation. In her final acts, Brynhild becomes a figure of fierce clarity. She refuses to stand as a pawn in the games of others. Her decisions, however devastating, are taken with the unbroken resolve of a warrior who understands the cost of destiny. Her death is not a surrender, but a final assertion of autonomy, a way to reclaim the narrative torn from her hands. The image of Brynhild on her funeral pyre echoes across the centuries. The flames rise once more around her, not as punishment, but as transformation. Fire becomes both her beginning and her end, the element that marks her as divine even in death. The sagas tell that she and Sigurd are united in the afterlife, their tragedy sealed into the memory of the North. Her story influenced far more than Viking imagination. Medieval poets carried her tale into new cultures. Later storytellers reshaped her into emblematic figures, from Wagner's Brunhilde in the Ring cycle to the countless retellings in European literature. Through each interpretation, her essence remains. A warrior maiden caught between fate and freedom, punished for compassion, undone by love, and remembered for her unyielding strength. Among the Valkyries, Brynhild stands alone as the one who fully embodies the intersection of myth and human emotion. Others remain distant, radiant, untouched by the uncertainty of mortal choices. Brynhild walks a different path, one marked by grief, fire, and the quiet dignity of a spirit confronting its own limits. Her tragedy itself becomes a form of legacy. Through her, the Norse myths reveal the cost of divine interference in human lives. Through her, they explore the weight of destiny, the danger of oath-breaking, and the sorrow of longing for a world that cannot be regained. Her fall from divine grace marks the moment when the Valkyrie ceases to be an ideal and becomes a character, someone readers feel, mourn, and remember. Brynhild's story also reshapes the image of the Valkyrie as a whole. No longer merely riders of fate, they gain emotional complexity. They are not untouched by the world they guide. They can suffer beneath its weight. They can burn, not in divine fire, but in the raw heat of heartbreak. And yet, even in her sorrow, Brynhild remains powerful. Her wisdom, though tragic, illuminates the fragility of human bonds. Her fury reveals the depth of her passion. Her final act, though steeped in loss, restores her autonomy, a testament to her unbroken spirit. As the saga closes, her memory lingers like smoke over a battlefield long after the warriors have fallen silent. Brynhild becomes the echo of a truth whispered through the Old Norse world. Even those shaped by fate are not free from the wounds of the heart. Through her story, myth becomes human, and through her ending, she becomes immortal not as a flawless divine, but as a figure whose fire, sorrow, and strength continue to burn across the ages, shaping our understanding of the warrior maiden who lived and died between two worlds. Chapter 9: Sigrdrífa and the Runes of Awakening. The northern world holds many stories of Valkyries who cross the boundaries between divine duty and mortal destiny. But among them rises a figure whose light is softer, wiser, and shaped not by battle alone. She is Sigrdrífa, the victory bringer, a Valkyrie whose presence in the poetic Edda reveals a dimension of the myth often overshadowed by the clash of swords. Through her, the Old Norse imagination explores a different form of power, the power of knowledge, of symbols carved into wood and bone, of runes whispered to those chosen to rise above fear. Her saga begins with sleep, enchantment, and a moment of awakening that changes the course of a young hero's life. Like Brynhild before her, Sigurdrífa lies in enchanted rest, shielded by a ring of flames. Yet her story turns not toward tragedy, but toward illumination. When the mortal hero Sigurd rides through fire to reach her, he is not merely breaking a curse. He is stepping into the realm of sacred instruction, crossing a threshold where myth and wisdom meet. The Edda describes her awakening with solemn clarity. She rises in armor that gleams with a pale radiance, her face carrying the stillness of one who has dreamed beyond the bounds of mortal time. But instead of sorrow, she brings knowledge. Instead of prophecy shaped by doom, she offers understanding shaped by purpose. Her first spoken words are a blessing, not only for the hero before her, but for the world he must navigate. In these verses, Sigurdrífa becomes more than a Valkyrie. She becomes a keeper of runes. The runes she teaches carry meanings older than kingdoms and deeper than the poetry that preserves them. They are symbols etched with intent, tools for courage, healing, protection, and victory. Through them, the Norse expressed their belief that the unseen forces of the world could be shaped if only one knew how to speak their language. The runes offered power, but also discipline. They required clarity of thought and steadiness of spirit, qualities valued as highly as strength in a society shaped by harsh winters and unrelenting conflict. Sigurdrifa's instructions unfold like a ritual hymn. She tells of victory runes, carved into sword hilts and blessed to steady the hand in battle. She speaks of ale runes, used to guard against treachery in feasting halls where danger often arrived disguised as hospitality. She reveals wave runes, meant to protect those who sailed the turbulent seas, and birth runes, meant to ease the suffering of women who brought life into a world as perilous as it was beautiful. Each rune carries a story. Each story carries a worldview, one shaped by resilience, caution, and respect for the unseen rhythms of existence. Sigurdrifa becomes the guide who draws back the veil, allowing mortals to glimpse the delicate web that binds their lives to cosmic forces. Her knowledge is not meant to dominate the world, but to understand it. Her teachings reflect a belief that wisdom is not a privilege, but a necessity for survival. Through her, the Valkyries step into a new role. They are not only the riders who descend through mist, nor the tragic figures undone by fate. They are guardians of cultural memory. They hold the law that teaches mortals how to endure, not only in battle, but in sickness, in storms, in childbirth, in the fragile space where life and death intersect. Their wisdom becomes a form of protection, as vital as any spear or shield. This aspect of the Valkyries reveals much about the emotional landscape of Viking society. The people of the north lived in a world of uncertainty. Storms could swallow ships without warning. Disease could strike in the quiet of night. Enemies could rise from across the sea or from within one's own hall. In such a world, knowledge became a form of armor. Runes became anchors that steadied the mind when the world grew dark. Sigurdrifa embodies this synthesis of power and meaning. Her teachings do not promise control over fate, they promise partnership with it. The runes she offers are not spells of dominance, but instruments of harmony, ways to navigate the inevitable with grace and courage. They reflect a worldview in which the sacred and the practical are intertwined, where spirituality is woven into everyday acts of survival. Her presence also reveals the role of women in Norse magical traditions. While warriors stood at the front lines of battle, women often held the deeper knowledge of healing, prophecy, and ritual. The Verla, seeresses who traveled from village to village, carried staffs decorated with symbols of power, performing ceremonies that touched the boundaries between the living and the dead. Sigurdrifa's teachings echo the voices of these women, preserving their influence in mythic form. In this sense, the Valkyrie becomes a bridge between the divine and the human, not only through battle but through wisdom. She reminds us that the Norse did not view knowledge as separate from strength. Both were essential. Both were honored. Both were tools for facing a world that demanded clarity of mind and resilience of heart. As the hero receives her runic teachings, the saga shifts from myth into reflection. Sigurdrifa's knowledge becomes his compass. Her words follow him into the trials that await, battles fought with iron, choices carved by loyalty and betrayal, moments where courage is needed more than skill. Her influence shapes not just his actions, but his understanding of the world and his place within it. This moment, small within the vast tapestry of Norse mythology, carries deep significance. It reveals a society that valued instruction as much as inspiration. The god-touched warrior is not complete without wisdom. The runes, like the Valkyrie who speaks them, stand as reminders that survival depends not only on strength, but on knowing when to speak, when to act, and when to listen. Through Sigrdrífa, the sagas portray the Valkyries as luminous carriers of ancient knowledge, beings who remember truths that mortals forget, who hold the keys to understanding life's unseen currents. Her presence softens the image of the Valkyrie without diminishing her power. She becomes the embodiment of spiritual learning, reflecting a world where myth served as a vessel for practical guidance. Her verses reach far beyond their original telling. They influenced later traditions of magical writing, inspired medieval interpretations of runic lore, and shaped the modern imagination of Norse mysticism. Through her, the concept of the Valkyrie expands into something timeless, a figure who teaches not only through battle, but through insight, discipline, and sacred remembrance. In the end, Sigurdrifa's significance lies not in her awakening alone, but in what she awakens within others. Her runes become the quiet force that guides heroes through darkness. Her teachings become the echo of a culture that sought wisdom in every hardship. And her story becomes a testament to the belief that strength grows not only from the clash of steel, but from the silent moments when one receives knowledge and carries it forward. Through her, we see that the Valkyries were never solely agents of death. They were guardians of life's deeper truths, those fragile threads of understanding that help a person move through a world shaped by uncertainty, courage, and the enduring hope that wisdom can light even the darkest path. Chapter 10. The Feast in Valhalla's Golden Hall. A vast golden hall rises in the imagination of the Norse, a place where death sheds its final shadow and purpose glows anew. Its roof, the sagas say, is layered with shields. Its rafters are spears. Its doors open so wide that 800 warriors may stride through them at once. This is Valhalla, the home of the honored dead, where the fallen gather not in sorrow, but in strength. Here, the Valkyries stand as guides, guardians, and caretakers of souls who once lived beneath the weight of battle. In this realm, their duty continues with renewed focus. The Valkyries, who once hovered over battlefield mist, now move with steady grace through a hall filled with light that does not fade. They welcome the warriors chosen by their judgment, greeting each with a quiet dignity. This moment, the first breath of the afterlife, carries profound meaning. To the Norse mind, death was transformation, not finality. A warrior did not simply end. He crossed into a new chapter shaped by courage and effort. The Valkyries become the bridge between those worlds, their presence softening the boundary where breath once ceased. Inside Valhalla, the air holds a sense of preparation. The fallen, now called the Einherjar, gather in endless ranks, their spirits renewed, their bodies restored. But before their training, before the clashing of weapons and the daily battles that define their existence, the Valkyries offer nourishment. They carry mead brewed from mythical sources, poured from horns fashioned with runes of blessing. This drink is more than refreshment. It is a symbol of belonging. It marks the warrior's acceptance into Odin's chosen host. The sagas describe these rituals with reverence. The Valkyries move through the hall with calm, luminous strength. Their movements reflect the balance of gentleness and power that defines their myth, beings capable of deciding death, yet entrusted with comforting the dead. They serve not as servants, but as guardians who sustain the warriors for the destiny that awaits, the final battle foretold in prophecy. This duality reveals the depth of their role. On the battlefield, their judgment is fierce. In Valhalla, their care is unwavering. Through them, the Norse imagination shaped a vision of the afterlife built not on rest, but on readiness. The honored do not fade into sleep. They sharpen their skills, engaging in daily combat that ends only when their bodies rise whole once more, untouched by wounds. Each evening, they gather again inside the hall where the Valkyries pour mead and prepare the feast, returning the warriors to strength for the next day's trials. These rhythms reflect a worldview rooted in perseverance. The Vikings lived in a land where survival was a constant struggle, harsh winters, treacherous seas, and the threat of conflict shaped their reality. The afterlife they envisioned mirrored this truth, offering not escape, but purpose. Even in death, one continued to strive, to fight, to grow. Valhalla became the ultimate expression of honor, a place where effort was eternal and courage never extinguished. Through this lens, the presence of the Valkyries becomes even more essential. They are not only the arbiters of who earns entry, they are the guardians who ensure that the chosen remain prepared for what the sagas call Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods, the final confrontation between creation and destruction. The Valkyries train the eyes of the warriors to look toward that distant horizon. They nourish their bodies and steady their spirits. Each task, no matter how simple or ceremonial, is tied to the greater battle that will one day shape the fate of all 9 realms. Their leadership in Valhalla also reveals how the Norse understood gender within myth. Strength was not confined to men, nor was nurturing confined to women. The Valkyries embody both forms of power. They choose the worthy with fierce precision, and then sustain them with gentle resolve. Their presence reminds us that mythic authority is not limited to one expression. It flows through many roles, bound together by purpose. Archaeological echoes of these beliefs appear across the Viking world. Drinking horns decorated with carved female figures hint at the idea of divine women serving mead in the afterlife. Burial goods, feasting bowls, weapons, and animal bones suggest that feasting was central to their vision of eternity. These objects bridge the physical and spiritual worlds, offering clues about how deeply the idea of Valhalla shaped the hopes of those who lived and died in the Norse lands. The ritual of feasting in Valhalla also reveals the emotional depth of their mythology. For people familiar with hardship and loss, the idea that warriors would be welcomed into a hall of light brought comfort. The Valkyries, who once guided them into death, would ensure they were not forgotten. They would serve them, speak to them, prepare them for what lay ahead. This tenderness, woven into a myth often dominated by war, held profound meaning for those who feared the silence of the grave. The sagas emphasize that the Valkyries' watchfulness never ends. Even within the safety of Valhalla, their gaze remains sharp. They oversee the training grounds where the Einherjar test their strength each day. They stand beside Odin as he observes the warriors who will one day defend the gods. Their presence is both reminder and reassurance. Destiny is approaching, but it will not be faced unprepared. In this setting, the Valkyries gain a kind of serenity not seen elsewhere in their myth. They are no longer torn between duty and emotion, no longer caught in the sorrowful stories that shape figures like Brynhild. Here, their roles align perfectly with the cosmic order. They become symbols of continuity, of life beyond death, of honor beyond fear, of purpose beyond loss. As evening settles over the Golden Hall, the firelight dances across shields hanging high overhead. The warriors gather at long tables, their laughter echoing through the vast space. The Valkyries move among them, offering mead that shimmers in the glow. Each gesture, each cup poured, carries centuries of meaning. It reflects the belief that death is not erasure, but return, a return to strength, to duty, to connection with the divine. And when the feast ends, when the candles burn low and the warriors drift into peace before the next day's trials, the Valkyries remain vigilant. Their eyes sweep across Valhalla's great hall, watching over the chosen, guarding the flame of destiny that burns within each of them. They wait for the day when the horn of the final battle will sound, when the doors of Valhalla will burst open, and the army they have guided, nourished, and strengthened will march into the storm. For now they serve, not as servants but as stewards of honor, not in submission but in purpose. Through them, the Norse imagined an afterlife shaped by meaning, a place where the fallen rise, where courage becomes eternal, where judgment leads not to oblivion but to a new beginning. In Valhalla's Golden Hall, the Valkyries complete their sacred circle, fierce in choice, gentle in care, eternal in their watch. Chapter 11. Valkyries in Anglo-Saxon Memory. A grey dawn spreads across early medieval Britain, its light falling over a landscape shaped by invasion, migration, and the meeting of many northern worlds. Long before the kingdoms of England formed their borders, poems moved through its mead halls like drifting embers, verses of warriors, fate, and the spectral women who governed the rhythm of battle. In these echoes, the memory of the Valkyries appears once more, transformed yet unmistakable, carrying their presence far beyond the fjords of Scandinavia. This chapter of their story unfolds not in the sagas of Iceland, but in the poetry of Anglo-Saxon England, in a culture linked to the Norse through shared ancestry, shifting alliances, and centuries of exchanged myth. In Old English verse, the battlefield becomes a place woven by unseen hands. Warriors saw their lives not as isolated moments, but as threads in a tapestry crafted by powerful female figures. These women, though unnamed in most poems, carry the familiar weight of destiny. They move at the edges of conflict, controlling the rise and fall of kings, guiding the last breath of heroes. Their presence feels older than Christian England, older than the written word itself. In works such as the Finnsburg Fragment, the Battle of Brunanbar, and other early martial songs, the language hints at supernatural forces shaping victory. Phrases describing battle weaving or fate binding reflect a worldview in which death was a patterned event, not a silent accident. Many scholars see in these metaphors a remnant of a shared Germanic belief, one that included the Valkyries or their cultural counterparts, known in Anglo-Saxon tradition as well Syrian, the slaughter choosers. The linguistic connection is unmistakable. The Old English term mirrors the Old Norse Valkyrja, both pointing to women who select those destined to die. Yet the Anglo-Saxon versions appear less as armored riders and more as shadowed, spectral beings, watchers who hover over the clash of shields, weaving doom with gestures as subtle as the shift of wind. These figures reveal the deep resonance of the Valkyrie myth across Northern Europe. They appear wherever Germanic-speaking peoples carried their stories, through migration, through trade, through shared experience in warfare. Before England became a Christian kingdom, it was a tapestry woven from Anglo-Saxon, Danish, and Norse threads. Their myths mingled in the low-lit halls of warriors who understood death intimately. Anglo-Saxon poetry turns frequently to the imagery of weaving to describe the workings of fate. This metaphor parallels the Norse concept of the Norns, who carved destiny into the roots of the world tree. Yet in England, the loom becomes a darker instrument. In the Exeter book, battle is described as the web of spears, spun by hands unseen. Other poems speak of fate's weaving as a force that no man can escape. These verses carry the emotional weight of warriors who knew that every conflict carried both glory and doom. Into this worldview stepped the Welserian, not riding through sky, but standing silently in the smoke of war. Their presence felt more than seen. While their imagery differs from the radiant Valkyries of Icelandic sagas, the purpose remains the same. They mediate the threshold between life and death. They choose, they observe, they seal the fate of the brave. One of the most striking examples appears in the Old English charm known as with faestis, against a sudden stitch. Here, supernatural women, sometimes interpreted as Valkyrie-like beings, are described as causing pain with spears, riding through the air with a martial ferocity. Though the charm blends medicine with myth, the imagery aligns closely with Norse tales of Valkyries, directing wounds with spiritual precision. The presence of such beings in healing magic reveals something profound. The Anglo-Saxons did not confine them to poetry alone. They saw these spectral women as real influences on the body and spirit, forces whose actions could bring injury or relief. Just as the Norse invoked divine aid through runes, the Anglo-Saxons invoked protective words to counteract the harm believed to be caused by these unseen riders. This shared belief across cultures reflects a deeper truth. The warrior ethos dominated the imagination of the early medieval North. Life was fragile. Death arrived swiftly. In such a world, the presence of beings who judged courage and shaped victory brought both terror and comfort. They made sense of uncertainty. They transformed loss into meaning. Anglo-Saxon writers, influenced by both Scandinavian contact and their own inherited traditions, gave these figures a poetic restraint. They appear rarely, but their shadows loom large. In Beowulf, the inevitability of fate weird echoes the Norse understanding of destiny governed by higher forces. Though no Valkyrie is named in the poem, the sense of a woven, inevitable end mirrors their role. The hero's final battle reads like a moment observed by unseen judges, waiting for his fall to seal his place among the remembered. Cultural exchange deepened these parallels. Vikings settled across England for centuries, leaving traces not only in trade routes and political alliances, but in mythic imagination. Warrior grave discovered in England, containing weapons and ritual objects, show practices aligned with Scandinavian belief. Inscriptions and symbols hint at a world where Norse and Anglo-Saxon understandings of fate mingled in complex ways. The spread of Valkyrie-like figures across northern Europe also reveals a fundamental human impulse to personify the forces that shape life and death. By envisioning female spirits overseeing battle, early medieval societies gave voice to the emotions that war stirred within them: fear, longing, pride, sorrow. These beings offered a framework for understanding the cost of conflict and the honor found within it. In Anglo-Saxon memory, the Welserian embody the thin veil between the visible and invisible. They stand as reminders that every battle is more than human effort. They reflect the belief that the world is shaped by hands beyond the reach of mortals. Their presence reveals a culture deeply attuned to symbols of courage and the unavoidable fate that meets every warrior. While Scandinavian sagas preserved Valkyries in vivid detail, armor shining, horses leaping through storm, the Anglo-Saxon mind held them in the half-light, as shadows woven into the fabric of battle itself. This contrast enriches their legacy, showing how a single mythic idea can shift shape across borders while retaining its emotional core. In both traditions, these spectral women watch with solemn clarity. They carry the stories of the fallen. They weave meaning from violence. They turn death into a threshold and courage into a form of immortality. Their endurance across cultures shows just how deeply the idea resonated, that somewhere beyond the clash of swords, beyond the cries of victory and loss, there were beings who understood the cost of war and bore witness to every life carried into its final silence. Through the poetry of Anglo-Saxon England, the Valkyries gain a new voice, quieter than the thunder of the sagas, yet filled with the same gravity. They reveal that myth is not confined by borders. It travels where human hearts seek answers, where warriors face the unknown, where people look to the unseen to understand the fragile boundary between life and eternity. And in that shared imagination, the Valkyries endure, not only as riders of the storm, but as guardians of courage, reflections of fate, and the silent weavers who stand where every battle meets the long, unbroken thread of destiny. Chapter 12: Christianity and the Fadding of the Old Gods. A long twilight settled over Scandinavia as the first Christian bells echoed across its shores. What had once been a world shaped by runes, rituals, and the presence of unseen spirits now shifted beneath the weight of a new faith. Old temples were abandoned. Sacred groves fell to silence. And across the northern lands, the stories of the gods began to flicker like embers losing their glow. In this uncertain hour, the Valkyries, once radiant riders of fate, faced a transformation as profound as the world that carried their name. For centuries, they had been symbols of courage, destiny, and the unbreakable rhythm of war. They rode through Stormlight, chose the slain, and guided the honored dead to Odin's golden hall. But as Christianity spread through kingship, mission, and law, the foundations of their mythology began to erode. The new faith offered different promises: salvation instead of glory, peace instead of struggle, humility instead of heroic striving. The warrior's afterlife faded beneath visions of heaven and judgment. In this shifting landscape, the Valkyries could not remain untouched. Sagas written during and after the conversion carry the marks of this cultural transition. The divine fire that once surrounded the Valkyries begins to soften. Their supernatural ferocity dims beneath the influence of Christian sensibilities. They take on the shapes of noble maidens, wise women, or tragic figures, still powerful, but no longer the fierce arbiters of fate they had been in their earliest forms. Their battles become metaphors. Their choices become lessons. Their divine authority becomes something more symbolic than literal. This transformation reflects the tension between two belief systems: Christianity sought to redefine the spiritual world, narrowing the vast pantheon of spirits into a single divine hierarchy. Yet the old myths did not vanish overnight. They lingered in the minds of poets, farmers, sailors, and storytellers. The Valkyries became part of this lingering, figures caught between a fading pagan cosmos and the rising Christian worldview. In many sagas, they are recast through moral interpretation. A Valkyrie's strength becomes less divine and more human. Her judgment reflects virtue rather than cosmic balance. Her interactions with mortals turn toward themes of love, sorrow, and repentance. Brynhild's tragedy gains a Christian shade, a fall born not only from fate, but from pride and forbidden passion. Other Valkyries become symbols of chastity, loyalty, or spiritual struggle. This softening does not diminish their presence. Instead, it reveals how myth adapts in order to survive. The conversion era was not a moment of erasure, but of blending. Pagan symbols intertwined with Christian teachings in ways both subtle and profound. Churches rose on sites once sacred to the old gods. Festivals shifted names but retained their seasonal meanings. The sagas, written by Christian scribes, preserved ancient tales while framing them in a worldview that questioned, yet honored, their mythic power. Within this transitional world, the Valkyries took on new roles. Instead of divine warriors, they became reflections of ideals still valued by the people: courage, devotion, wisdom, and the enduring human desire to be remembered. They shifted from choosing the slain to inspiring the living. Their memory became a reminder of a time when death was a pathway to purpose rather than only a final judgment. The emotional landscape of the Norse people also shaped this transformation. As the old religion faded, so did its certainty about the afterlife. Valhalla no longer stood as the unquestioned destination of the brave. The Norns no longer held absolute control over destiny. The Christian promise of salvation brought comfort, yet it also distanced people from the warrior identity that had defined their ancestors. In this space of longing, the Valkyries remained as echoes, reminders of a world that celebrated courage without apology, a world where fate was woven by divine riders who moved through mist and moonlight. They became symbols of heritage rather than belief, figures who retained emotional resonance even as doctrinal power diminished. Archaeology supports this gradual fading. The runestones of late Viking Age Scandinavia show a shift in imagery. Crosses replace magical symbols. Prayers to Christ replace invocations of Thor or Odin. Yet patterns of female figures, slender, poised, carrying cups or spears, persist in certain carvings. These images may not depict Valkyries directly, but they carry their shadow, the memory of women who once welcomed warriors to halls beyond the mortal world. Folklore, too, preserves their presence. In later Scandinavian tradition, mysterious women appear in meadows at dusk, offering warnings or blessings. In some tales, they guard hidden treasures. In others, they appear before battles or storms, no longer divine, yet still connected to fate. These stories show how the Valkyrie image quietly survived the rise of Christianity, transformed, but not erased. The sagas themselves serve as a testament to this endurance. Though written centuries after the conversion, they preserve the emotional truth of the old beliefs. In their pages, the Valkyries remain luminous figures whose choices carry the weight of both worlds. They embody the conflict between duty and desire, fate and freedom, themes equally meaningful in Christian and pagan contexts. Their decline in religious authority parallels the fading of Odin, Thor, and Freyja. Yet the Valkyries endure in a unique way because their essence is not tied to rule or worship, but to human experience. They represent courage in the face of death, guidance in moments of fear, and the fragile line between life and the unknown. These themes remain universal, even when religions change. As Christianity reshaped the spiritual landscape, the Valkyries became part of cultural memory rather than living belief. Their power moved from ritual to story, from invocation to reflection. Yet their legacy grew in this very transition. Freed from religious constraint, they became symbols available to poets, historians, and artists across centuries. Their influence stretches far beyond medieval Scandinavia. Romantic writers revived them as figures of tragic beauty. Composers transformed them into musical icons. Modern storytellers reshaped them once more into heroines of fantasy and myth. Each rebirth reflects the same truth. The Valkyries adapt because they embody something timeless, the human confrontation with fate, the yearning for meaning in struggle, and the hope that courage might outlive death. As the world of the old gods dimmed, the Valkyries did not disappear. They slipped into twilight, carrying their stories into new eras, waiting for each generation to rediscover the power of their presence. Their transformation mirrors the endurance of myth itself, a force that bends with history, yet refuses to break. And in that twilight, where old beliefs fade but never fully die, the Valkyries remain, not as warriors of the storm, but as echoes of a world that still whispers through stone, saga, and memory, reminding us that even when a religion fades, its stories continue to shape the human heart. Chapter 13: Victorian Revival and Romantic Reinvention. A new era dawned over Europe long after the world of the Norse had faded into legend. The year was no longer marked by the turning of pagan seasons, but by the hum of industrial cities and the restless search for meaning in a rapidly changing world. Amid smokestacks, crowded streets, and the growing din of modernity, something unexpected happened. The old myths awakened once more. From the depths of forgotten sagas, the Valkyries rose again, not as the quiet fate spirits of early Scandinavia, nor the softened figures shaped by Christian scribes, but as towering icons of romantic imagination. The 19th century became the crucible of this rebirth. Romanticism, sweeping across Europe with the force of a cultural storm, sought escape from the mechanized world. Artists, poets, and composers turned their eyes toward ancient stories, yearning for the raw emotion, grandeur, and mystery that seemed lost in the modern age. The myths of the North, preserved in old manuscripts and newly translated, offered exactly that. They carried the weight of untamed landscapes, tragic heroes, and spirits who moved between worlds with solemn purpose. Into this revived fascination stepped the Valkyries, figures that Victorian minds remade with vivid intensity. No longer bound to the subtlety of medieval poetry, they were reimagined as fierce supernatural riders sweeping through storm clouds. Painters depicted them with braided hair flying in the wind, armor gleaming with celestial fire, and spears angled like lightning. Their horses galloped across skis heavy with thunder, their presence announced by winds that tore across mountaintops. These images owed as much to artistic imagination as to ancient tradition, yet they captured something essential: the Valkyrie as an embodiment of strength and destiny. The most influential moment in this revival came from the world of opera. Richard Wagner, in his monumental cycle Der Ring des Nibelungen, gave the Valkyries a sound that would echo through culture for generations. The ride of the Valkyries thundered into existence with soaring orchestration that felt like the arrival of a storm. The music carried the energy of galloping hooves, shrieking skis, and celestial warriors descending into battle. Wagner's vision fixed the modern image of the Valkyrie, noble, powerful, radiant in the heart of chaos. Though his interpretation departed from the nuances of Norse myth, it captured an emotional truth that resonated deeply. In an age searching for symbols of transcendence, the Valkyrie became an icon of awe. Victorian audiences embraced this reinvention. They saw in the Valkyries a blend of ancient ferocity and modern ideals. Their strength aligned with romantic fascination for the sublime, the overwhelming power of nature, spirit, and imagination. Their femininity, framed by armor rather than domesticity, challenged Victorian expectations while reinforcing the era's fascination with noble, untouchable heroines. Painters like Arthur Rackham, illustrators of mythic compendiums, and scholars who translated the Eddas all participated in shaping this new Valkyrie. Each brushstroke and phrase enlarged her presence. Each reinterpretation added spectacle, drama, and grandeur. The once mysterious choosers of the slain now stood as bold protagonists in exhibitions, operas, and illustrated volumes. This reinvention was not faithful to history, but it was faithful to feeling. The Victorians did not seek accuracy. They sought a mirror for their emotional landscape. In an age troubled by industrial change and social transformation, the Valkyries embodied a world where destiny felt visible, where courage was monumental, and where the human spirit could ascend beyond the constraints of ordinary life. Their revival also reflected a growing interest in nationalism across Europe. The northern myths were seen as cultural roots, a heritage to be reclaimed and celebrated. Valkyries became symbols of a heroic ancestral past, invoked in art and literature to inspire unity and pride. Yet this same fascination could be twisted, later influencing political ideologies that misused the myths for their own designs. Myth's power, once awakened, becomes difficult to control. In Victorian literature, the Valkyries expanded once more. They appeared in poetry as ethereal guides, in novels as symbols of unstoppable will, and in scholarly works as curiosities bridging the gap between history and imagination. This layering of interpretations distanced the Valkyries from their original context, yet it kept them alive in the cultural consciousness. The Romantic era also brought a renewed fascination with women who defied convention. The Valkyries, perceived as fearless and independent figures, resonated with shifting ideas about female agency. They appeared in art as both protectors and avengers, their strength celebrated rather than feared. This portrayal echoed older Norse traditions of powerful women, shield-maidens, seeresses, and warrior queens, though filtered through Victorian ideals of purity, grandeur, and tragic beauty. Through this lens, Brynhild and Sigrdrífa were rediscovered not as complex figures shaped by fate, but as archetypes of noble suffering and spiritual might. Their stories were retold with sweeping drama, emphasizing themes of sacrifice, passion, and divine conflict, elements that the romantic imagination eagerly embraced. Yet beneath all the embellishment, a constant thread remained. The Valkyries still represented the threshold between worlds. They still embodied the mystery of fate, the solemnity of death, and the fierce dignity of those who stand at the edge of eternity. In every reinvention, this core survived. Victorian reinvention breathed new life into their legend, preserving it through art, music, and literature. Though distant from historical truth, these portrayals carried the emotional resonance that had always defined the Valkyries. The essence that captivated ancient warriors found new expression on the stages of opera houses and the canvases of romantic painters. Their revival demonstrates the enduring flexibility of myth. Stories shift to meet the needs of their time, and in doing so, they remain alive. The Valkyries who once rode through the mists of battle now soared across orchestral thunder. Their ancient strength became a symbol of modern imagination. By the end of the 19th century, the Valkyries were no longer bound to Scandinavia. They had become part of the global cultural imagination, fierce, noble, and fearsome, shaped by centuries, yet still carrying echoes of the first stories spoken under northern skies. Their journey from pagan spirits to romantic icons reveals a simple truth. Myth survives when it transforms. The Valkyries changed with each era, yet they never vanished. They adapted, expanding into symbols far beyond their origins. And in their Victorian rebirth, they reclaimed a kind of immortality, not in the halls of Valhalla, but in the collective imagination of a world still seeking meaning in the age-old tension between destiny, courage, and the vast unknown. Chapter 14. Archaeology confronts the legend. Across the northern landscape, the earth begins to speak. What sagas once whispered in the glow of firelight now rises from soil, stone, and silence. For centuries, the Valkyries lived in the realm of legend, radiant figures riding through mist, born from mythic memory rather than human footprints. Yet modern archaeology has unsettled that boundary. With every burial uncovered, every rune deciphered, and every artifact lifted from the dark soil, the old stories shift. The Valkyries step closer to history, their outlines gaining substance that ancient poets may have sensed long ago. Turning point came when archaeologists reopened graves once assumed to belong to men, warriors buried with weapons, strategy pieces, horses, and symbols of command. In one remarkable case, a high-status grave in Birka, Sweden, revealed a warrior laid to rest with a full set of arms, swords, arrows, axe, shields, and two horses. For over a century, scholars took it for granted that the occupant was male. Yet DNA analysis told a different truth. The bones belonged to a woman. This discovery did more than challenge assumptions. It opened the door to a new interpretation of myth. The idea of women as leaders in war, once dismissed as poetic embellishment, suddenly carried archaeological weight. The Valkyries, long viewed as supernatural constructs, began to echo with memories of real women whose presence shaped the battlefield. Scandinavia holds more of these buried stories. Grave containing spearheads, armor fragments, and ceremonial weapons appear with female remains across Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Some belong to noblewomen who may have held military authority. Others hold symbols of tactical command, gaming pieces used to map out strategies, indicating roles that required knowledge of warfare rather than direct combat alone. These finds breathe life into the idea that the sagas were not inventing their warrior women from empty imagination, but amplifying memories of lives lived in the shifting borders of early medieval society. These discoveries illuminate a striking truth. Mythology and history often grow from the same emotional soil. The Norse were storytellers who preserved their world not through parchment, but through memory. When a woman lived with remarkable strength, leadership, or martial skill, her legacy may have carried through generations, exaggerated, transformed, shaped by poetic rhythm, until she became part of the divine chorus of the Valkyries. The runes deepen this possibility. Across carved stones and fragments of ornamentation, depictions of armed female figures emerge. Some hold spears angled with authority. Others lead horses or stand in martial poses beside symbols of protection and fate. These images may not name the women they portray, yet they reveal how the Norse imagination saw female power, not domestic or distant, but active, commanding, and woven into the spiritual framework of war. In some carvings, a woman offers a horn to a warrior, a gesture long associated with the Valkyries welcoming the slain to Valhalla. Whether these carvings depict mortal priestesses or divine intermediaries remains uncertain, but their presence reveals a cultural landscape where the boundary between myth and lived experience was thin. The people who carved these stones understood that the sacred could move through human hands. Even weapons found in female grave challenge the modern assumption that warfare was exclusively male. While not every buried weapon indicates a life spent in combat, the recurring pattern suggests that women may have held symbolic or practical roles within martial culture. They may have led households whose survival depended on defense. They may have acted as ritual figures, bridging death and honor. They may have ridden beside armies, carrying both strategic insight and spiritual authority. These possibilities do not diminish the mythology, they enrich it. They suggest that the Valkyries were not born only from imagination, but from observation, from glimpses of women who held courage equal to any warrior, who made decisions that shifted the course of battle, who stood at the edge of the known world with clarity and resolve. Archaeology also uncovers ritual objects that echo the Valkyries' symbolic purpose. Amulets shaped like riders, brooches depicting shield-bearing women, grave offerings that blend martial and spiritual themes. These artifacts show that the Norse did not separate fate from flesh. The women who carried weapons in life, or who guided warriors in ritual, could become figures of reverence in story. Through oral tradition, their memory grew into mythic archetypes, protectors, choosers, guides of the fallen. The merging of myth and material evidence reveals a culture that embraced layered identities. A woman could be a keeper of the household and a commander in times of crisis. She could act as healer, seeress, diplomat, or defender. The sagas preserved these complexities in the language of legend. Archaeology now brings that complexity into the light of history. The Valkyries, in this context, become more than divine symbols. They become reflections of a society where women held defined yet flexible roles, where power could shift depending on circumstance, and where courage was not confined to one gender. The myth remembers what history sometimes forgets. The artifacts confirm what the sagas hinted. Yet the discoveries also remind us of the emotional foundation beneath the myth. The Norse lived in a world shaped by loss and conflict. Death came swiftly. The belief in Valkyries, women who guided the fallen toward purpose, offered comfort in uncertainty. If real women stood beside warriors, offering counsel, protection, or ritual preparation, their presence may have inspired the image of divine guardians watching from above. This interplay between myth and history does not diminish the spiritual power of the Valkyries. It deepens it. It shows how belief grows from the lived experience of a people seeking meaning in hardship, structure in chaos, and honor in death. The Valkyries endure not because they were invented, but because they embodied truths woven into the lives of those who told their stories. Archaeology continues to uncover fragments of this world. With each grave opened, each artifact examined, each rune interpreted, the Valkyries come into sharper focus. They do not lose their mythic grandeur. Instead, they gain roots, a lineage not only of divine imagination, but of human memory. The legend and the lived world begin to merge. The riders of fate step down from the clouds and walk the earth as women who led, who fought, who commanded respect. They stand as both myth and history, intertwined in a way that reveals the depth of Norse belief. And as the soil continues to yield its secrets, it reminds us that myth is never separate from the people who carry it. The Valkyries live because someone, long ago, saw a woman whose courage defied expectation and remembered her. In that remembrance, myth and truth meet. The Valkyries stand at that threshold still, their presence echoing across centuries, proving that even the most radiant figures of legend can cast shadows long enough to touch the world we walk today. Chapter 15. Legacy of the Choosers of the Slain. A long arc stretches from the ancient north to the modern world, drawn not in stone or sword, but in story. It carries the silhouettes of women who once rode across battlefield mist, their forms shaped by fear, reverence, and the quiet knowledge that death itself could be guided. Over centuries, the world changed. Faiths shifted, kingdoms rose and fell, languages transformed. Yet the Valkyries endured, their presence slipping through the cracks of history like a long, unbroken thread. Their legacy has become more than myth. It has become a mirror, one that reflects the human search for meaning, courage, and connection across time. In the old world, the Valkyries stood as guardians of a warrior ethos. They judged the brave, guided the honored dead, and carried the weight of cosmic order. Their presence gave shape to a belief that death was not an end, but a passage, a doorway opened by divine hands. Through them, the Norse found dignity in the uncertainty of life and hope in the inevitability of mortality. As centuries passed, their roles transformed. Medieval scribes softened their edges. Victorian artists cast them in stormlit splendor. Modern storytellers reimagined them as superheroes, commanders, protectors, or tragic figures bound by destiny. Yet beneath every reinvention lies the same core idea: the Valkyries as bridges between worlds, figures who move where human fear meets divine promise. Their endurance in literature speaks to this power. From the sagas preserved in Icelandic manuscripts to the epics rewritten in Romantic verse, the Valkyries appear in forms shaped by each age. Writers use them to explore themes of judgment, agency, and sacrifice. They step into stories not only as warriors, but as symbols of choice, of the moment when a life is measured and a path is set. In art, their presence is equally striking. Painters across centuries have imagined them riding through storm clouds, offering cups to fallen warriors, or standing with spears angled toward the horizon. Each depiction captures a different truth. Some emphasize their divinity, others focus on their strength or tragedy. Together, they build a visual legacy that stretches across cultures, revealing how beauty and power intertwine within myth. Music carried their story into yet another realm. Wagner's sweeping portrayal gave them a thunderous, commanding voice, one that still shapes the popular imagination today. Though far from their historical origins, this musical vision cast the Valkyries as forces of nature, immense, unstoppable, rising from the orchestral depths like a storm rolling across the sky. Through sound, they became immortal in a new way. In modern media, the Valkyries have become global figures. They appear in films, novels, games, and graphic art. Some stories echo their mythic roots, depicting them as divine guides of the dead. Others reimagine them entirely, turning them into heroes of science fiction, leaders of fantasy realms, or symbols of independence and resilience. Their transformation shows how myth adapts to the needs of each generation. What once comforted the warrior now inspires the dreamer, the rebel, the seeker. Yet even as they shift, their emotional resonance stays constant. The Valkyries represent choice, the moment when fate touches a life. They embody strength not defined by destruction, but by clarity, purpose, and connection to something greater. They remind us that honor is not a relic of the past, but a living principle. And they carry the memory of a world where courage was not measured by victory alone, but by how one met their final moment. Their endurance also speaks to the human longing for meaning beyond the visible. The Vikings saw the Valkyries in the midst of battle. Later generations imagined them in storms, in dreams, in the quiet between breaths. Today, we see them in stories that grapple with loss, destiny, and identity. They give form to the unseen forces that shape lives: choice, consequence, transformation. Archaeology has further grounded their legacy in the real world. The discovery of female warrior burials, armed figures in runic art, and ritual objects once tied to belief reveals that the Valkyrie myth likely grew from lived experience. They are not just symbols of imagination. They are reflections of ancestors who walked the earth with strength that defied expectation. Myth and memory intertwine, reminding us that stories often preserve truths that history overlooks. The Valkyries' modern legacy extends beyond fiction and scholarship. They have become symbols in cultural identity movements, representing empowerment, heritage, and resilience. Across Scandinavia and beyond, their image appears in festivals, artwork, civic emblems, and personal tattoos. People look to them not only for their mythic power, but for their human resonance, the idea that one can face the unknown with dignity and determination. Their endurance reveals how myth functions as a living lens. It evolves, adapts, and reflects the values of those who tell it. The Valkyries once taught warriors how to meet death. Today, they teach people how to meet challenge, how to carry strength without arrogance, how to move through change without losing oneself, how to honor the past while stepping into the future. Even in academic circles, their legacy continues to grow. Historians explore their cultural influence. Linguists track their evolution through languages. Anthropologists study their role in shaping ideas of gender and power. Each perspective adds another layer to the story, expanding their significance far beyond the battlefield. The Valkyries remind us that myth is not static. It shifts like wind across northern seas, carrying reflections of human hope and fear. What began as spirits of battle became symbols of wisdom, love, tragedy, and triumph. What once guided the slain now guides the imagination of millions. And still, their essence endures. They are the guardians of courage, the eternal presence that stands beside the fragile moment when a person chooses who they will become. They are the voices of destiny, the quiet force that reminds us that every path carries consequence. They are the bridges between life and death, past and present, myth and meaning. In their long journey from ancient fires to modern screens, the Valkyries have become more than choosers of the slain. They have become keepers of humanity's oldest questions. What gives life purpose? What remains after we fall? How do we face the unknown? The answers are never simple. Yet the Valkyries endure because they do not offer certainty, they offer presence. They stand at thresholds, watching with solemn clarity, reminding us that every moment is a choice. Every choice shapes a story, and every story echoes far beyond the life that lives it. This is their legacy, not bound to one age, one culture, or one belief, but carried across time as a symbol of courage, destiny, and the unbreakable spirit of the ancient North. Conclusion: when Stormlight rides the sky. A quiet horizon stretches across the northern sky, where clouds gather like distant memories, and the wind carries the voices of stories older than stone. In this fading light, the Valkyries rise once more, not as warriors alone, nor as spirits confined to a single age, but as symbols shaped by centuries of fear, hope, and wonder. Their legend began in a world forged by harsh winters and endless seas, where survival demanded courage and meaning was carved from the edge of the unknown. Yet the story they leave behind reaches far beyond the mountains and fjords that gave them birth. At their core, the Valkyries are mirrors. They reflect the human need to understand struggle, to frame death with dignity, and to believe that courage is seen, even in the final breath. To the Norse, they offered a promise that no life of bravery would vanish into silence. Through them, warriors found reassurance that the chaos of battle was not random, but shaped by hands that understood honor. Their story evolved with time, shifting as cultures transformed. They became divine messengers, tragic heroines, wise teachers, and enduring icons in art and imagination. Yet through every retelling, their essence remained steady. They stood at the threshold between worlds, guardians of the moment when life breaks open into something uncharted. In this role, they spoke to a truth shared across ages, that destiny is not merely a chain of events, but the meaning we choose to give to our journey. The world that once believed in them has changed beyond recognition. The longhouses have fallen silent. The sagas have become literature. The battlefields where their presence was felt are covered now in grass and time. But the Valkyries endure because they answer questions humanity still asks. What is courage? What is purpose? What lies beyond the horizon of death? Their image rides the sky not as a memory of war, but as a symbol of the human search for significance. They remind us that every struggle deserves to be understood, every life deserves to be honored, and every ending carries the possibility of meaning carried forward. When stormlight cuts across the clouds, when wind sweeps over quiet fields, when we feel the pull of something larger than ourselves, the old stories rise again. The Valkyries do not return as divine figures guiding the slain, but as echoes of the ancient belief that our choices matter, that our final moments are part of a wider tapestry shaped by courage, love, and remembrance. To remember them is to remember the people who first spoke their names, a culture that faced hardship with unyielding resolve, a world that sought meaning in the spaces between breath and silence, and a truth that still endures. Every life leaves a mark, carried forward in story, in memory, and in the unseen currents of time. The Valkyries ride the stormlight still, not to claim the fallen, but to remind us that nothing courageous is ever truly lost.